where to start with all of that? I'll probably touch a little bit on, it's okay, the English for everybody. We can have the, c'est possible de poser des questions en français après si vous voulez. So reconstrained design is a bit strange. And I felt quite guilty at the beginning to be throwing another term into this already very bloated design lexicon, all of these different types of design, from design fiction, speculative design, critical design, design for debate, discursive design. There are all of these terms floating around from probably the early 2000s, and all of them in some way critiquing, questioning, examining more mainstream versions of design. This came about after the RCA period. So in 2015, I left the Royal College of Art after 10 years of teaching, doing a PhD there. I did my master degree there. So really my home for many, many years. And throughout that period, we'd been developing approaches to what we called at the time speculative design. But this was receiving a little bit of criticism from probably 2012 onwards, that it was privileged, that there were all these wealthy RCA people developing these design ideas that essentially went to die in the gallery. So what impact were they really having? What were the limits of critical and speculative design? Very many provocative projects disseminated very easily across the media, often globally. Our work and our students' work at the RCA featuring in galleries like MoMA, the V&A in London, the National Museum of China in Beijing, many places. But the actual real-world impact of this critique was actually quite small. And this was the critique that people started to pick up on a little bit around 2012, and it resonated for me, or with me. 2015, I left the RCA, moved to this idyllic island of Madeira in Portugal, and I entered the institute. They led me into an open room, and they said, "This is your desk, this is your office. Let us know if you need anything." And that was it. There was no brief, there was no project I was brought in to do. It was really an open book. And what it led to essentially was an opportunity to revisit, to question, to examine, to reflect upon the previous, say, 10 years of practice. That's where reconstrained design came from. So it's a long introduction to a short description, hopefully, but where it comes from was a reflection on the strengths of speculative design. The freedom afforded to the designer to move away from the constraints imposed by industry. So if you're working for a client, if you're working in the marketplace trying to sell your designed outcomes, there are all these constraints in place, and those constraints limit practice. Speculative design allowed for a freeing of those constraints, where we could really question the role of technology, examine technological futures, relations to philosophy of technology and technique, where we can start to examine the whole history of design critically. And we were doing that, but the problem was speculative design, it can be essentially unconstrained. So the possibilities can be endless, and this is where a lot of the very kind of fanciful, spectacular, dreamy imaginaries came about, where anything is possible. They're very provocative, they can be very sexy, they disseminate very well across the media because they're very they look very good in print or on a plinth in a gallery, and that's why the work was receiving a lot of press and was easy to disseminate, but why it was not really impacting on anything beyond this very small community. And so the idea of reconstrained came about through focusing more on the idea of constraint in design, something very familiar to the designer. A lot of our education, if you've had a design education, constraints will surely have come up at some point. It came up in a So I'm just going to read a little bit some quotations here. It came up in an interview Charles Eames had with Madame Elamich. It was the Eames Q&A from 1969. And she asked Eames, speaking on behalf of the couple, Charles and Ray, does the creation of design admit constraint? And Eames replies, design depends largely on constraints. What constraints? The sum of all constraints. Here is one of the few effective keys to the design problem. The ability of the designer to recognize as many of the constraints as possible, his willingness or enthusiasm for working within these constraints. And these constraints are of price, of size, of strength, of balance, of surface, of time, and so forth. Each problem has its own peculiar list. So the reconstraining design approach largely follows Eames' counsel there, but acknowledges that there are grander, more complex, covert constraints at play that we don't even talk about. They become so normalized that designers simply work within the system. So what reconstrained design does, and what I'll talk a little bit more about from now on, is a revealing or an examination of these covert constraints, how they limit the potential of design practice, and how we can then, once identified, reconstrain. This leads us to new approaches to designing. So the constraints we're talking about are, first of all, acknowledging the limitations and the problems with design practice today, obviously in relation to things like climate change and the desire within certain communities to transition to more appropriate or responsible forms of design. When we acknowledge and understand the need for that transition, the constraints become helpful because they allow us to identify the barriers to that transition. So we can think, first of all, what are the problems? How could we work around them? And then the form of design practice that leads to, or identifying preferable ways of practicing, identifying the barriers and figuring out then ways around them. So it's a little bit complicated in practice, but the first step is very much about identifying what the constraints are. It's a little bit of a sidestep here. This is Andrew Targovsky's tri-element model of civilization. I'm not going to get into complicated ideas and definitions of what a civilization is. So it's going to take the debate very much off-piste. But what's helpful for the purposes of this talk is the bottom division, the separation into culture, which for Targovsky is a value-driven continuum process, and infrastructure, which for him is technology-driven and additive. And we can then divide constraints into these two categories. In reality, it's all messy. All of the constraints somehow inform each other and work together or conflict in interesting ways. But for the purposes of the talk, I'm going to neatly make this division and see, first of all, how cultural constraints, the belief systems, etc., then inform the way we design, the way practice happens under the conditions of, I guess, the Western notions of modernity. That would be the culture in which design evolved and still continues to inform practice today. So the first constraint is progress dogma. Many philosophers of technology, Langdon Winner, Jacques Ellul, all of these critique this idea of progress and faith in technology, but this is all very much about how these beliefs influence the practice of design. And so this, I mean, it has a very long history. This is a quote from the Whale and the Reactor talking about technological advancement and faith. But at the end, Winner goes on to say that these developments will lead to the next wave of innovation, and this will be our salvation. So it's whatever problems we face, whether they're related to climate change, whatever, if we have faith in technology, we will be able to solve all problems. So this has a long legacy. I mean, what's been very exciting and interesting for me throughout this project was really delving deeper into different histories. This is a painting that was commissioned by Jordan Mott, the inventor of the coal-burning stove in 1862, painted by Christian Schussler. It's called Men of Progress, and it was commissioned to celebrate the inventors the engineers, etc., who are seen to have positively influenced the course of civilization in the United States during that period. And so we have a few characters here. Here's Cyrus McCormick, who invented the mechanical reaper. Charles Goodyear invented vulcanized rubber, the tires on all of our motor cars that make them drive smoothly, quietly. Elias Howe, who invented the sewing machine. And William T.G. Morton, who invented surgical anesthetic. So whilst it's difficult to argue that a lot of these inventions indeed improve the comfort and well-being of humans during this period, but there are other people on this diagram whose inventions are a little bit more ambivalent. This is Samuel Colt. Any ideas? Samuel Colt, invention, the revolving gun. Seen as being something positively advancing the course of civilization. And it talks about this ambivalence of technological development, of notions of progress. This is, in many ways, reveals the American mentality, the frontier, the civilizing mission of the country, obviously still very prevalent today. We can jump forward a little bit to 2016 and see a lot of similarities between these two images. Lots of old white men, lots of power sitting in the room. We have here Peter Thiel sitting next to Donald Trump, the inventor of PayPal and probably one of the darkest human beings on the planet. Apart from Elon Musk, who you'll see in this, probably the darkest person on the planet. Jeff Bezos, the creator of Amazon. People who wield huge amounts of power over all of our lives, but under this legacy of the 20th and the 19th century, the idea that technology will prevail, it will improve the quality of all of our lives. Of course, they're making billions in the background, but this is the value system under which a lot of design happens. You can see obviously the power of Apple and their use of design. You're talking about that earlier on. It's a very powerful tool, but it's built under particular value systems. I'll talk a little bit more about how that impacts the design process later on. When we talk about this belief system, I refer a little bit here to Sheila Jasanoff and Kim's idea of the socio-technical imaginary. This is defined as collectively held, institutionally stabilized, and publicly performed visions of, this is the important bit, desirable futures, animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order, attainable through and supportive of advances in technology. And this is a classic example of that, the idea of the socio-technical imaginary. It blends contemporary technological developments with extrapolations into utopian futures. This is the Future Armor exhibit commissioned by General Motors, developed by the designer Norman Bel Geddes for the 1939 New York World's Fair. And of course, General Motors, the builder of motor cars, they want these motor cars to be fast and powerful. Fast and powerful motor cars need big roads for us to enjoy that speed. So this was really the dream of building these superhighways, linking the massive American cities, essentially stopping the sprawl of the major cities and allowing people to live in these urban, suburban communities with a white picket fence and the American dream. So it's all about commuting, it's all about the motor car, and it's this utopian dream of the future. What's interesting about Future Armor is it's combining the federal government ideas, the road building program, corporations, so the needs of General Motors, and the role of design, the ex-set designer Norman Bel Geddes designing these massive dioramas that hundreds and thousands of people would see during the World's Fair. What was interesting about this, of course, is the roads were built. So by 1964, the next World's Fair in New York, America was connected by these superhighways. Was it a utopia? No, it wasn't. We realized, obviously, with hindsight, that the motor car leads to massive problems, whether it's insurance fraud, the car crash, traffic jams, climate change, Bigger problems like the destruction of the motor cities like Detroit, where we have industrial failure and mass unemployment. Progress dogma, the constraint there is that the designer is never allowed to think about the negative implications of the things that they're designing. It always has to be positive and utopian, because negative things aren't funded, negative things don't sell products. I just threw this in there as recently in the wrong place, but this is just to highlight the fact that these kind of imaginaries haven't stopped. We might be past modernity, but the dreams of modernity, the role of technology in life is still very powerful, as represented by Elon Musk's dream of SpaceX station on Mars. We're not really progressing very far. So for each constraint, I will show a reconstraint. And this is the design approach. This is a project that we developed a very long time ago now with long-term collaborator Jimmy Loiseau. This goes back to 2000 and 2001. It was my master project at the Royal College of Art. And it was starting to develop this critical stroke speculative design approach, where we are analyzing possible futures, speculating on what could happen through looking at contemporary trends, developments in specific technologies, advances that are just around the corner, and then using design techniques to communicate what life might be like should that technology be realized. This 2000 was around the time, kind of peak mobile phone excitement. Mobile phones hadn't been around for very long, so they were very topical. It's the first time that a product like that had become portable. So phones typically were in boxes or attached to cables in our homes. So this idea of being completely mobile with a device like that was very powerful. So for us, it made sense that the next extrapolation of that would be for the phone to enter the body. So this is, I guess, posing questions of the cyborg, ideas of humanism, technology entering the body. And it was for us very much a critical debate of exploring what this technological future could be. The product here is a telephone implanted in the tooth during routine dental surgery. We spoke to scientists at British Telecom who gave us, I think I saw David chatting there in the audience, your old colleagues, David, from British Telecom. They advised us on the technology. They're saying that, well, what it would use is near-field magnetic effects to energize a dormant chip in the tooth, and then that would be translated through bone transduction into discrete vibrational sound that would arrive in the ear, and nobody else would be aware of it. And this technology realistically could be built within a couple of years. I have no idea what I just said. I just memorized their counsel so that when we spoke to visitors to the gallery, this was at the Science Museum in London just after the RCA, we could sound like it was plausible. So it's mixing a few things: desirability, building on current trends, technological plausibility, and then the kind of imagery. This was I carved this out of clay and then did a resin mold, a silicon mold, and then cast it in epoxy resin. So we have this iconic image to represent the concept. From there, it went viral. This was purely accidental. It was never a goal of ours, but the press officer at the Science Museum picked up the idea, started talking to the press, Reuters got involved, and before we knew it, we had this almost a full page spread in the Sun newspaper. It's a readership of between 6 and 7 million per day. This is a genuine scan of Time magazine from 2003, I think it was. The coolest inventions of 2002, you can see there at the top. This is, I promise you, authentic. I still have the check from Time. We got paid $120 for the use of the image, and they never ever talked about the plausibility, how real this thing was. But more interesting was this, the kind of letters that we were receiving. This was from a physician from Stanford Medical School, and you can read it there. As a physician, I believe the technology you describe in your press release has the potential for producing immense social harm. This social harm would include psychological trauma and angry behavior, and both of them are in the workplace and the home. Of course, a lot of designers would be crying to receive such a scathing rant about their their project. But for us, this is the product. This is the output. This is the goal. So there's this discussion taking place about a possible future before that future has happened, with people who are hypothetically expert in the field. I still think that there is great value in this. If we look at the impact of social media today, the social media just arrived in our lives, and we learn how to use it, and we deal with problems after the event, as we're seeing right now with the banning of phones in schools, and children suffering from this kind of psychological trauma from entering into chat rooms and doing different things online. And there's no debate. The debate happens afterwards, and it's always been that way with technology. So this here is the first reconstraint, the idea of putting products in the world hypothetically and having the debate about whether they're good or bad and what the problems might be, and then allowing for an iteration, a redesign, a ban, whatever it might be, to put more appropriate forms of technology into our lives. What time is it? Because it took us a hell of a lot of time to get started. I might sort of skip some of the things a little bit.
Really as he wants.
Yeah, I'll not go into this one in quite so much detail. This was much later, but a very, very similar approach, looking at predictive algorithms. So starting off with another quote, this one from Meyer Schonenberger and Kenneth Cukier on a book called Big Data. And I like this last line here. What role is left for intuition, faith, uncertainty, and originality? When things become increasingly automated, when we're delegating more and more decisions to algorithms, what's left for us to do? And it's a project exploring that, bit influenced by this article in Forbes. It was a story about a young female, 14 years old, who, after going online, her browsing behavior had been analyzed by Target's marketing, and the particular browsing pattern that she had used suggested that she was pregnant based on their data research. Her father, they then sent advertising material for pregnancy paraphernalia, different products, etc. Her father was very angry, went to the store, spoke to the manager and said, "What's going on? You're sending my daughter this stuff about pregnancy. You're trying to get her pregnant." The store manager apologized. They went home. And long story short, it turns out the girl was pregnant. He'd been away on business. She'd had a party. And her pregnancy had been diagnosed is the wrong word. It makes it sound like a medical condition, but had been predicted by Target's predictive browsing algorithms. So this gets into these kind of Kafkaesque experiences that we get with new technologies. If you go online and look at stories around Amazon Echo, there are endless reports of it purchasing really weird articles and behaving in very strange ways because it's largely unregulated and it's just evolving. So with this project, we were working with a data scientist from the University of Edinburgh. He was working with professional sports people to predict when they might get an injury from overtraining. And so we started sort of pushing and probing the context in which this kind of predictive algorithm might work. And so, okay, could you tell me when I'm going to die? He said, "Oh, that's a bit vague. But if we reduce it down to predict whether I'm going to have a heart attack or not, that's more possible." So this is a Bayesian network diagram to predict when you might have a heart attack. So it's got obvious things like family history, is there a susceptibility to heart disease, using things like your reward card from the supermarket. It might be able to identify whether you're smoking or buying lots of alcohol. And there's using your smartphone when you're running around, there is an accelerometer in here that can detect movement. So if you're kind of a lazy person and you don't move very much, but suddenly it detects you running for the bus, clearly it can predict that your chances of a heart attack are going up. And the more sophisticated the data inputs, the more accurate the prediction becomes. But this is still quite positive. So when we're starting to, or trying to encourage a debate about the technology itself, whether this is preferable or not, we were looking for something a bit more contentious. So this is a Bayesian network diagram to predict when you might have a domestic argument, when you're going to next fight with your partner. It uses machine learning techniques, so it gets better and more accurate through time. But with this one, we modified the design a little bit to incorporate a microphone. This is before Amazon Echo was marketed and released. So it's a little bit like the Echo, although it's not doing the tasks that the Echo does. It's simply listening. And so with all of the different data streams coming in, it gets better and better at predicting the argument. It's looking at things like word tone, the words that led to the argument, the volume. When an argument's happened, it could understand what that is and then analyze the different trends or patterns that led to that. And what we didn't want this to become was an app where you're just looking at your phone, oh, am I going to have an argument or not? We wanted a kind of more ambient device. So this is the product sits on the, let's say on the table or a mantelpiece, and it uses a very simple kind of interactive display. There we go. It's a little bit inspired by the analog record player. So when something's spinning at 33 RPM, the dots are stationary. In this case, when the dots are rotating clockwise, the argument is in the future. The household is harmonious, everybody's getting on very well. But when it starts going anti-clockwise, the atmosphere is deteriorating. Something's problematic, and it slows down and it slows down, and the argument's getting closer. And then when it stops, woof, something's going to happen very, very soon. But of course, you've got this as a feedback mechanism. You can see if it's slowing down, reflect upon what might be causing the argument, and then try and diffuse it, apologize, do something that will interrupt the predictive algorithm, and then it'll start spinning clockwise again. And this is completely plausible. And what it's trying to do is get us right into that question there. What role is left for intuition, faith, uncertainty, and originality? If we need algorithms now, or if we have algorithms that can detect our social interactions, the most intimate, private conversations, and give us feedback on those, what's left for these kind of ideas of intuition and faith? And interestingly, I think it was in 2019, I don't have the slide here, but there was an article in The Independent in the UK that was talking about the latest Amazon research, and it was starting to do exactly what we were predicting here, that the Amazon had been listening to so many conversations, it was becoming capable of predicting conflict within houses. So the point here is, how do we feel about that? Is this a preferable future or not? Okay, speeding up a little bit. The next one is more general value systems. This involves things like the metric systems through which we evaluate contemporary products. And really going back to the machine age, this is from Marinetti's Foundation Manifesto for the Futurists. He says in 1909, we declare that the splendor of the world has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed, the beauty of the racing car with its bonnet draped with exhaust pipes like fire-breathing serpents. A roaring racing car rattling along like a machine gun is more beautiful than the winged victory of the Samatha race. So here, really the beginning of the machine age, and it's this growing belief in power and speed and efficiency. All of these metric systems, the way we evaluate products, it's the origins there in the machine age. And we can see again how this starts to influence the role of design throughout the 20th century. Streamlined, modern, probably the earliest true form of industrial design. Key American designers, again, Norman Bel Geddes, Raymond Loewy, Harley Earl. The first wave of industrial designers who are starting to really explore the importance of form. So here you have not just the physical experience of speed and power, but its visual representation, the teardrop form, sleekness, aerodynamics, the idea that the car looks like it's going fast even when it's standing still. And this seen as being ultimately highly desirable. And this is where the constraints really start to come in. We get super conflicting constraints because the belief in power, the desire for power, this very kind of masculine role of or dream of the motor car, when we shift, when we have a paradigm change towards electric vehicles for sustainable reasons to save the planet, we end up with monsters like this. This is the Hummer EV. It's an electric vehicle. But here we go. It's weighing in at 4,000 kilograms, which is nearly twice the weight of the petrol version. And its battery alone weighs 1.4 tons, right? And there's enough lithium, nickel, and other high demand minerals in this to power nearly 400 e-bikes. And so this is where we get these conflicting constraints, the legacy of the 20th century informing design decisions today. And so when we talk about kind of green environmental issues, green electric vehicles, Elon Musk ranting away about the power of the Tesla and the planet, it's all bullshit. They're constrained by this whole period here, this era. So the reconstrained design here is very much breaking away from these legacies. We can see it. I won't go into Dyson, but the way we evaluate these kind of products has its legacies very much in the last century. Automation, another dream, another value system, very prevalent today. So this is the Reconstrained here. It's another old project from Jimmy and myself, project from 2003. Coming very much from the mobile phone era. So rather than the kind of celebration or let's say the projection of the mobile phone to the tooth phone, this was starting to say, well, what is a phone? What's the purpose of the phone? And looking back to this period, this is the famous Gilbert Scott telephone box from the UK. And what we have here is a situation where the designer or architect didn't just think about the product and the interaction, but the space in which it's used. So with the mobile telephone, the user dictates the context. You can be driving a car or sitting on the bus and talking away. And as a result, you are, I would say, teleschizophrenic. You're existing in this physical world, but you're also projecting yourself into the telephonic world and talking to somebody somewhere else. And as a result, existing badly in both worlds. The telephone box was interesting because these were really heavy metal objects with really thick glass. So when you're inside, you were dislocated from the outside world. They were quite silent. There wasn't noise. You weren't bumping into people. You couldn't do anything else. You were just on the phone. So there was this focus on the phone call. And it was the same with early phones at home. They had a cable that linked to the wall, and people would typically put them in hallways or quiet places. So you would leave the household away from the television, away from disruption, to focus on the phone call. So this is very much inspired by that idea. It's a telephone which combines the telephone itself and sensory deprivation theory. The sensory deprivation theory is coming from these tanks where you lie on your back in a vat of salted water. The water is heated to body temperature, and the salinity, the salt there gives you buoyancy. So you're floating. It's got a roof on it, so it's totally black. It's totally silent because it's all acoustically padded. So the only thing in a sensory deprivation tank, the only thing that you're experiencing is nothing. Your brain is left to totally shut off because there is absolutely zero sensory input. It's using exactly the same principle here, but leaving the auditory channel open. And that then is linked to a telephone somewhere else in the world. So the voice of your friend or family member is just coming in, but you can't see anything. You can't hear anything else. There's no other distraction. And it allows for a total focus or celebration of the phone call. There's just an image of this at the Ars Electronica Festival in 2004. We shipped these tanks because the first version here was in a Guinness swimming pool in Dublin. But the water was really cold. So all people were thinking about is how cold they were. It didn't work at all. But then we built these tanks that had a proper water heater in, and we could heat the water to 37 degrees. It worked really well. And with this, we had, I think, 40 people during 5 days going in the tank with a free phone call for half an hour talking to somebody else in the world. And it really worked. There's a little video here showing the thing in use. I won't show all of this.
Hello?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, I was just wondering is everything cool on your end? It feels really weird to be
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good. I'm glad that we decided to meet up.
Yeah,
It's been a long time.
So what are you getting up to these days?
Well, I'm living with a Spanish guy now
Really? Whereabouts?
in north of Smithfield.
How long have you been there?
Like, 8 months now. Have things changed since you left?
You know, I think for him, things haven't changed terribly. He got really quickly into the kind of settling down, but not.
I'll stop that. I was hoping to turn the sound down. It's not possible. But the reconstrained design bit here then is shifting away from the kind of iterative steps through which technology typically evolves. So after the smartphone, we've got then version 4, 5, 6, 16, 18 or whatever, all small steps from the previous one, but all becoming increasingly complicated, largely neglecting the original purpose of the phone, which is remarkable. The fact that I could take this device and talk to my sister in Australia, it's quite incredible. So this is very much about celebrating the experience and saying that as designers, we don't just need to follow the pathways. We don't need to be constrained by the trends through which technological artifacts typically evolve, but we can step back and really reflect upon what we're actually designing, the experience of telecommunication, and then come up with something completely different. Another project, this is from 2007, I did in collaboration with Philip's design team in Eindhoven. Slightly weird one, but it touches a little bit on the previous one of the delegation of decision making, very sensitive human things to computers. So here we have these dating websites. There's a personality test, and then numbers will be crunched and personality patterns will be identified, and you'll be paired up with people that the system deems you to be compatible with. And so with this, it was a matter of kind of reconstraining again this belief in apps to do these things and going back to something quite primordial. This is the smell blind date, where we were trying to rediscover what has become largely lost. That's the human sense of smell. And it was really supported by two different things. There was it was discovered that the Disana people in the Amazon, it's believed by them that within the tribal group, people share a similar odor. But they say that individuals' unique odor, which is called the Oma Seriri, is a combination of natural personal odor, odors acquired through food consumed, odors caused by emotions, and the periodic odors related to fertility. And this is the important bit. Marriage is only allowed between individuals with different odors. And this is true. It's the champion sense within the community, the sense of smell. Now, for us, asking that question, who smells the same? Do you smell the same as me? It's bizarre. I don't even know how I smell, but it's because smell was largely devalued during the Renaissance as we were championing the visual senses and the auditory senses, the beauty of music and art, and smell was seen as something animalistic. It was for the beasts. Humans were more sophisticated than smell, so everything was hidden and disguised. And it turns out now, as scientific research is very slowly starting to catch up, that there's a wealth of valuable information in smell, both the odors leaving our body, but the smells arriving. This was discovered as a project, a research project by Florida State University, talking about the role of the HLA allele. And this is something that's released by the apocrine glands. And this is where the useful smell comes from, and this is why it's slightly a provocative image. It's not intentionally that, but the apocrine glands are in the crotch area and the armpits. Typically, these become oxidized. That's when smell becomes bad, which is why we disguise it with perfume. But if you have reasonable hygiene, the smell then leaving the apocrine glands is full of valuable information. And that's really the starting point of this exploration. Other areas that we started to look at were smell diagnosis through smell, something that both Avicenna and Hippocrates talked about many, many years ago. Other research was revealing, this was 15 years ago that dogs were capable of smelling cancerous cells some weeks before any technological approach to that. So there could be ways of training dogs to smell cancerous cells way before you'd find out normally. And then approaches to cooking, playing with the idea of calibration through smell. The Maillard reaction, for example, when you're cooking meat, is full of something like 600 different components. And if you were really trained in smelling that, you can start to understand beef in the way that you might understand a bottle of wine, where people still have these abilities. So here it was, the constraints were really reconnecting with old forms of interaction, rediscovering what's human, and starting to explore what it would be like to rediscover these lost senses. Along these lines, there's a project from one of ONS PhD students, Valentin Grayat. So again, here we're talking about the value systems. For Valentin, he was questioning the idea of the smart, or he still is, it's ongoing, but the idea of the smart home. So smart homes being full of technology, full of sensors and computation, everything happening as if by magic. And so this is really the value system of contemporary technological corporations. Sony Ericsson have their home, Orange have a smart home. He was talking, he goes back in history as the IKEA one from 2012, but he traces this back right through to the 1950s and the smart homes of the massive American corporations of the period. There's the Monsanto one there on the left. And so what would be another form of smart? This is the reconstrained, so stepping away from this industry notion of smart to think about an ecological smart. So he's got the system developer A and the system developer B. This is the reconstrained is the ecological smartness. So using counterfactual techniques to reimagine a history where the smart home had followed a different pathway, and homes become, this is the nested house. It's a house that's communicating ecologically with its local environment. So energy becomes something sustainable. It's coming from the local environment. It's interacting with local creatures like the termites. There's a termite nest there that's with its microbiotic culture generating energy, and in some kind of symbiosis with the humans. This is an ongoing, well, there's only one slide of it there, but this is an ongoing project where he imagines then the history of that, an alternative smart running through from the 1970s to the present day. And with that, you get from the bifurcation moment to the present, a big divide. So here you have the early first steps, but then you would have a present day where this idea of ecological smartness would have become quite established and far more profound than it is otherwise. So getting now into the last stage, infrastructural constraints. This is going back to that original diagram, looking at the iterative nature of technology and how those value systems that we were talking about earlier influence our approaches to materials and making. So here we have the Zweiner. This doesn't sound very French, but the French 19th century furniture. And there's a quote here from Arthur Chandler, who notes that at the time, sorry for the French people in the audience, but he was noting that at the time of the 1855 Paris World's Fair, this was a very competitive World's Fair between the British and the French, where they were really showing the prowess of their industry and the craftspeople. He's noting that the French attitude was a mixture of pure greed and the dawning sense of the civilizing mission of France, that Africa would supply the raw materials, in this case, the exotic woods, and in return, France would supply the most precious of all commodities, its civilization. And so we're entering, I mean, this period goes back way before that, but like a lot of the talk, it becomes apparent when you look into these things that not a lot has changed. So focusing on a contemporary object, the iPhone, it's comprising around 75 of the 118 elements from the periodic table. And for reference, the human body is made up of about 30. And in an article for the Los Angeles Times, Brian Merchant described the pulverizing of an iPhone and then analyzing the resulting dust using mass spectrometry, X-ray fluorescence, and infrared analysis. And he suggests that to obtain the 100 or so grams of minerals found in an iPhone, miners around the world would have to dig, dynamite, chip and process their way through around 75 pounds of rock on every continent. That's in one iPhone. And this is where we get into that value system again, that we so celebrate the designed object. And sorry, it goes back to your the presentation you were talking about the iPhone earlier, that we within the design community, the value system is that we cherish these objects, the way we interact with them, that are beautifully designed. But what we don't take into consideration is where these objects came from. Where did the minerals, the rare earth elements, the exotic materials, and the manufacture and the conditions in which they're made, all of these things are ignored because our value system focuses on the status and the fetishized object. So the reconstraint here is we need to combine the means in the end. When we evaluate an object, we want to look at where it's come from, the conditions under which it was fabricated, and so on. I'll skip this. This talks about the making. It's Johnny Ive talking about the making of the iPhone, but it's a very similar thing. The most exotic machinery you can imagine that's out of the reach of 99% of the world. If I want to set up a small company making a phone to compete with Apple, how can I compete when we're only cherishing these particular objects that need these super complicated machines to make them? So here's something to challenge that. This is the Reconstrained design version. It's Tom Lynch's open source vacuum cleaner. He wanted to create this DIY vacuum cleaner. So the starting point was a Dyson. He borrowed, he was given a Dyson vacuum cleaner by Dyson. He took it apart and then rebuilt every single component in a DIY sense in the local woodwork shop. Everything was bought within, let's say, a 5-kilometer radius. There was a DIY stuff with little hose pipes, Coca-Cola bottles, a tiny little pump that he found in a local DIY shop, and some crappy plywood that he cut on the bandsaw in a local wood shop. Now, this cost around €40 and worked almost as well as a Dyson. The point is that it's all, you know where the materials came from, and you have the knowledge to repair them if something goes wrong. It was all completely open source. It was on a wiki. And the bigger plan for the project is that the wiki would then become international, and you'd have people in different cities, in different places around the world, loading the wiki full of their local information, where you would get the wood from, where you might buy a motor, what kind of sources would be useful locally. What's interesting about this, if the constraint of our aesthetic expectations becomes problematic, because this challenges what we expect a product to look like. The amount of styling that goes into this with its translucent plastics and beautiful injection molded forms is lost in this. Are we ready as a community to accept these kind of more challenging aesthetic styles? I thought it would have been interesting for Tom, I was his tutor at the time, to, let's say, imagine what a version of this vacuum cleaner would look like if it was made by, I don't know, Charles and Ray Eames, just to talk about someone we mentioned earlier. It's a talented designer with a particular style, and apply that to the vacuum cleaner would have been very interesting. Just to go beyond that stage of the pure DIY look. Another one of PhD students at ONS, Clarice Barbeau, is doing a similar thing, challenging the value systems within the textile industry. In this case, the idea of pigmentation. So the way standards have evolved throughout the 20th century, branding our expectations for a very particular color linked to a particular brand that will stay that same for several months, is an expectation, but it's a false expectation because it requires ridiculous amounts of horrible chemicals to bring that color fastness, to create that particular color. So with her Reconstrained, she's looking at the constraints within the fashion industry, within the textile industry, what is encouraging problematic practice. And then the reconstraining is starting to think about maybe seasonal colors or products or clothing that changes gradually through time, and that becomes a normal expectation. And it's super interesting because the constraints get into legal systems, political systems, different countries will have different expectations. But it's very practice-based. It's leading her to think about alternative design solutions. Another one of our PhDs, Etienne Axelos, pushing the idea of biomaterials. And again, through an analysis of history, looking at the rise of plastic in the 1950s, we can see the role of the design industry, the realization of new machines and techniques, the aesthetic qualities and the structural qualities of the plastic, the relationship between design and industry, and this kind of co-evolution. Well, if these biological materials are at that same state as plastic would have been maybe in the 1940s, what role can a designer play in shaping the behavior and the evolution of those materials into something usable and useful? So this is in collaboration with a material science laboratory in Nantes. And he's really, the constraints are becoming extremely interesting because the performative expectations of materials are a massive constraint. And he's trying to go beyond the typical products that we see here. Whenever a lot of students at the moment, it's very cool to be developing kind of biomaterials, but they end up as vases and lampshades and all of these quite banal objects. When we start to push the possibility and get into, let's say, complicated electronic products, where could biomaterials start to be useful, and what would be the constraints there that stop the evolution of that? This is the last one. It's the project that I did in Madeira with well, not just me, it was a team of about 5 of us under the guise of the Reconstrained design group. This was very much a project about energy, and so looking at the current approaches to energy, typically the burning of fossil fuels in these massive power stations on the periphery of the cities. Obviously there are alternatives, but this is really still globally the most dominant system. That energy being then radiated, distributed radially across countries through power lines and arriving in our homes and offices through these sockets on the wall. And so this is the generic ubiquitous solution across the world. How this constrains us, it constrains in 2 ways. As a designer, it constrains my ability to design outside of this system. Let's say I'm commissioned to design a toaster. There's talking about toasters at the moment. What I'll do is I'll think about the form. I'll think about the slots and the type of bread I want to toast. There'll probably be a dial that allows me to toast for longer or shorter periods of time. But then I'll simply put this on the end with a socket and I'll plug it into the wall. Electricity will be the dominant solution to the majority of domestic products. Now, what that does, it creates a very dislocated relationship with the energy that's necessary to power the artifact. And in a very similar way, as a user of the toaster, someone living in an electrically powered house, that energy arrives by magic. I don't know how far it's traveled. I don't know what the source is. I don't know how much I'm consuming. My only feedback is the bill that I might get at the end of the month. But apart from that, energy is this magic thing. And it's only been like that for way less than 100 years. This kind of ridiculous comfort we get from electrical products has created this illusion that we're in control, and we're absolutely not. If we continue consuming energy at this rate, it will be gone. Generations 2 or 3 away from now will not have these comfortable lifestyles. It's clear. So how can we start to rethink this relationship with energy and infrastructure? How can we reconstrain the design of products to incorporate all of the requirements, not just assume that half of them are already there through the infrastructure? Going off piste a little bit, you'll see why in a moment. I'm just going to talk about this project briefly. Another one, early one from Jimmy and myself. This is a project that's exploring the possibility of life after death. Slightly influenced in a critical way by Alcor Corporation. Alcor, they provide a service where after the human dies, they can be cryonically frozen in liquid nitrogen. And the belief is that advances in technology, nanobiotech, something along those lines, they'll advance to the point at some time in the future that body could be taken out of the vat, defrosted, and then these technological advances would repair the damaged cells, repair whatever killed that person, and they would be resurrected. Life after death through absolute faith in technology. And this isn't a fiction. this is real between, I think the two key countries are Russia and the United States. And I think in the United States, there are around 400 people cryonically frozen at the moment, all waiting to be resurrected at some point in the future.
The Big Bang is widely accepted as the event responsible for the creation of everything. The universe, its stars, its planets, its trees, animals, silicon, iPods and humanity. Nothing, including the human body, exists that cannot be created from these basic building blocks. Under normal circumstances after death, the human body would be assimilated back into this natural system. The afterlife device intervenes during this process to harness the chemical potential and convert it into usable electrical energy via a microbial fuel cell. A device that uses an electrochemical reaction to generate electricity from organic matter. This electricity is contained within a familiar dry cell battery.
Okay, this is 100% doable. It's not, I'm lying. It's technologically plausible, but legally very dodgy. So if we were to do this, we'd get into a lot of trouble with the law, but the proposal is genuine. And this is the life after death. It's not life in the form that we would imagine life to be. It's life as electrical energy. So this would be a memorial object, this battery. The question we pose then is, what would you do with the battery? Because obviously the energy is limited. It's not going to go on forever. What kind of product would you charge with this battery? And when would you use it and how would you use it? This is, for this, we invited, it's an open invitation. If anybody has ideas, let me know. But for an exhibition, we invited about 25 people to propose what they would do with the battery. We've just actually been invited to represent this in Saint Etienne, and we're in negotiations at the moment. And the idea is that we invited these people to write a brief text and propose an artifact, and it should in some way relate to the person who you're being reminded of. I'm not going to show many of them now, but this was from Mike Michaels. He's a professor of sociology in the UK, and he's talking about using the battery to power remote control. I've just turned my phone off and his text is in the phone, so I'm going to try and do it from memory, but he talks about, I'd like my battery to power remote control that's been modified to turn on a nature documentary. It will happen randomly, and the program must stay on for its full duration. The television can only be turned off at the mains. So he's hacking into the remote control. So the family are there. He's died. He's passed away. The family are watching TV, and then suddenly the remote control is powered through his energy to turn it onto a nature documentary, because that's what he wanted to watch when he was alive. And suddenly his presence is back in the room. He's there, like a magic ghost. And it's a beautiful moment. And that nature then would stay on, as the family would be encouraged to watch it, because it was his dream in life. But of course, sooner or later, it's not, the battery was modified. It's not powering the remote control all of the time, only during these special moments for the nature documentary. And as such, it could potentially last for several years. And it's that relationship with energy that we wanted to get into with this project that we developed, the gravity battery, to come up with a more tangible, a more meaningful relationship with energy. So how this works, it's really starting to push a situated version of design, where solutions aren't generic, but solutions are very much based on location. This is the view that you get of Madeira when you arrive on the airplane. There are no boats to Madeira at the moment, so it is literally the only way to get there. But you get the impression here that it's very renewably energy friendly. There are big banks of solar panels there. You can see the wind turbines. What you can't see at the bottom of this bay is a massive warehouse full of diesel generators, burning diesel 24 hours a day to generate the electricity for when the sun goes behind a cloud or when the wind stops blowing. And so whilst you get the illusion it's energy friendly, in reality there's a lot of diesel being burnt here. There's another problem. These are the constraints. When the first stage of the project was what are the constraints that are limiting the potential to transition to much more reasonable sustainable forms of energy generation. The second problem was that around 10 years before we arrived on the island, citizens were encouraged to buy their own solar panels and put them on the roof of their house. So that was for their own consumption. You generate power when the sun's shining, and then you use it yourself within the house, and you're off grid for that period of time. Now the problem is that a lot of people work during the daytime when the sun's shining, and there is no storage mechanism. The solution in place in most countries in the world right now is that when you're generating your own personal energy, if you're not consuming it in real time, you give it back to the grid for others to use elsewhere, and the energy companies buy it from you. Problem with that is the energy companies have spent 100 years making a profit from selling energy. They don't want to buy energy. That's a complete challenge to their business model. So as more and more people are getting solar panels, every year they reduce the buyback tariff. So in Madeira in 2015, it was around 7-1, the difference between the energy of buying energy, the price between buying energy and the price of selling energy. And people were stopping to use solar panels. However fantastic they are, there was this economic constraint that stopped them being used. So the solution here, just to cut a long story short, again, was to start to think about storage systems. That's the fundamental problem with a lot of renewables. Renewables act in real time, and we don't use energy in real time. We can change our behavior, or we can find ways of storing. And Madeira, this is another image of Madeira. This is the Cabo Geral. It's the highest cliff face in the whole of Europe, something like 790 meters, I think. You have all these cliffside communities. So the simple idea here was to use gravity. This is the very first working prototype that we made, tested here on the cafe. It's the 12-meter cafe, the terrace. And a water bottle from our laboratory filled, it's got about 17 or 18 kilograms of water. And how this works, the solar energy powers a DC motor. That DC, this gets a little bit technical, but the DC motor then goes through a gearbox, which increases the torque, but slows down the speed, allowing you to lift that weight slowly into the sky. And then the weight stays at the highest point until you want the energy. You want the energy back, you release the weight, turns the gearbox in reverse, which turns the motor in reverse, which in reverse is a generator, and you get usable electricity out of the other side. And you end up with this super plausible relationship between the mass that you're dropping, the height it is above the ground, and the electrical product that you're powering. There's a little demo of it in use. Okay. So as I said, you got this super tangible relationship. What we then discovered, it was even better than we thought. If you turn the volume up full, you can visibly see the weight falling more quickly, because of course you need more power to power the amplifier. That was the first version. There were a few problems with that, but it poses the question or the constraint of making. Who gets to make, or who can make, who has access to machines and who has skills, and that then becomes a constraint here. The efficiency of a gearbox is very much constrained by the quality of the manufacture, and if you use bad tolerances, the efficiency can go down enormously. So on this version, rather than make a gearbox, we just use one from a scrap motorcycle. So you have scrap motorcycles crashed all over the world, dumped somewhere, but the gearbox tends to remain intact. It's full of oil and it's protected by the casing, and it's a beautiful gearbox. So here I'm hacking this, buying this, well, we were given this by a local motorcycle breaker. We were only given the engine, there was no frame there, so we constructed this little framework. There's the same motor there at the top. But here we're starting to increase, gets a bit technical again, the ratio between the rotation of the shaft at the motor end and the rotation of the pulley at the other end. The bigger that ratio between the two, the bigger mass that you need to overcome the torque. But the bigger mass you have to overcome the torque, the more energy there is stored, and the bigger the artifact you can power, or the longer you have for powering. And that's what we spent the next year or so working on, developing these things. The second side of the project was working with communities. So like as with Thomas Lynch's vacuum cleaner, the idea here is that this is a kind of open source solution. And it's not just about the objects, it's also the people. So here we proposed this for a competition with the CCCB Gallery in Barcelona that we won. And part of the proposition was we'd go to this remote Scottish island with nothing apart from clothing and build a working gravity battery within a week. So this is the first day scouring the island, looking around various dumps, finally finding this in a chicken shed. Been stuck there for 10 years. A day later, it looked like that. We found these beautiful motors on the island that had a built-in gearbox. And we found a keyboard that was broken. We repaired the keyboard, plugged it into our gravity battery, and then had a demo there on the last day. So this was the original wiki. There's a website documenting the entire project now. And it's about taking back the control. So if we work around the constraints imposed by infrastructure, by the energy companies, by all of the materials and the systems that they control, and take it back with communities, with local materials and things, and we can function. I mean, it's not great at storing energy. You couldn't use this to power your Hummer, but you with a small change in behavior, it can really be quite useful. Very final few slides here, addressing that point I made about the vacuum cleaner, that this is pretty ugly and challenges our ideas about what domestic products look like. There was another strand to the project where we still looking at local materials. This is acacia, it's a Madeiran wood. We found this from a salvaged wood heap. This is my son and his friend gathering sand. It's black volcanic sand from the island. This is a single part mold where we poured in the black sand and also lead shot. This is the two hemispheres. So these are 30 centimeters diameter, but the two of them together weigh around 80 kilograms. Also pushing the question of who makes, we started engaging with local communities. This is a metal workshop not far from where I live. This is a wood workshop. Guy's not got much work to do, so he's fixing a plastic motorcycle part in his wood shop. But the idea here is we can invigorate local communities, and the building happens all together on the island. And this was the first product. It's a gravity lamp. In the middle there, you can see the concrete, the cement sphere, and it's got super low energy LEDs that are pulsing at a super fast rate. You can't see it. It's hitting a mirrored prism and beaming the light outwards. And it's almost like an egg timer. It falls down the light as the energy is being consumed. And there, it's about 2.5 meters high, and from top to bottom now it lasts about 40 minutes. And then when it hits the ground, the light goes out, and you've got to find a way of lifting it up again. And that could be with a hand crank, could be using a solar panel outside. There are whatever way is plausible. And just getting into slightly more complicated projects, here is a gravity-powered record player. It's continuing with the gravity motif. It's a vertical player with a linear bearing that rolls along. And we were first of all trying to do this without electricity at all. So shifting away from the constraint of electricity, the mass falls, and through a series of gearbox and damping mechanisms, you get the 33 RPM out. But it was beyond my engineering skills. So this has got electric motor and doing the job. That's the last slide. The Madeiran project is documented on Reconstrained design websites. And the Surf Futures is an ongoing project that we have within the CRD, looking at design pedagogy. And there is a focus there on counterfactual histories, which is the approach that Valentin's using for his PhD. So for any pedagogues in the room, please go and have a look at that website, because again, it's kind of open education here. We're launching and sharing briefs for other design schools to use and take advantage of. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What we're going to do, if you don't mind, if there are questions, I guess there are questions. I hope there are questions in the audience here present. You have? Yes. So what we're going to do for people online, I'm sorry because we have a sound issue. You're going to ask a question. I'm going to repeat it. Then you can answer. So at least people online hear what the question was about.
Okay.
Okay. You have a question, right? Yes, please. Yes.
J'espère, oui. J'espère.
Merci beaucoup pour la présentation. Et en gros, ma question, c'est vraiment une question globale. C'est-à-dire qu'en gros, si je comprends bien, on est en transition écologique pour avoir en fait un meilleur. Mais en même temps, on est dans un monde où les industries en fait grandissent et grandissent et grandissent. Et du coup, moi, ma question, c'est comment est-ce que selon vous, du coup, vous voyez le futur en fait du design, enfin s'implanter un peu dans le monde dans lequel on est, en sachant qu'on a vraiment envie de changer, mais en même temps, on a des structures, on a des industries qui, moi, j'ai envie de dire, bloquent en fait cette transition-là. Donc, comment est-ce qu'on fait en fait pour améliorer en fait cette idée-là de transition aujourd'hui?
Ouais.
I tried just because of the
Okay.
people online. Je le fais en français ou you wanted to? Will you want to answer in English? I mean, there are people in English and
I don't know what the audience there is.
Well, it was a session to be in English, so let's
Okay.
keep on English. I will try to translate. So basically, there are two poles, right? There is the environmental constraints that we are trying to get to address, and that's what you demonstrate here, and also the industry that is quite overarching a certain number of our structure, and have apparently the tendency to block any form of returning to a more environmentally friendly behavior, because there's a, I guess, capitalistic challenge there, a danger for them. So the question was, how do you see how the future might go based on this sort of friction that there is between the two worlds, right?
Ouais. Je vais reprendre en anglais ou en français?
En anglais.
En anglais pour
le.
C'est OK en anglais? Tout en discutant pas ici. It's the worst question to ask because there's no good answer. There's no good answer. It's the biggest challenge, largely because, as we see right now, it's the worst moment in my entire life. You're looking at something that the Eurasia consultancy said in 2016 after that Trump image was taken, but the power of non-governmental actors, the corporations, is becoming bigger than it ever has been in the whole of human history. So we can see that today through Musk's role within the United States government, his ability to lobby and change laws or approaches is bigger than anything we've ever seen, which of course then makes our challenge just as problematic. There's a few little things give me hope. One is that it will be impossible to continue like this for much longer. People have their head in the sands, particularly American politicians right now. They're going back to digging coal and burning things. The world will be burning before they know it, and we'll have no choice but to find alternative pathways. That's the dark side, that sooner or later we'll be forced to act differently. Other thing that gives me hope, well, this is more positive, is the role of pedagogy and the attitudes of young people. So I have a few colleagues here teaching with, working with. There is a hunger amongst younger people for change, and this is what makes me very hopeful, is I see our students coming through just really desperate to design differently, responding to exactly what these challenges are. That's really our opening statement each year. It's a design research master, and we start with the statement, well, design at the moment is largely broken. The approaches that we developed in the past and the approaches that we've been teaching for many years are no longer working. So what is design? That's your challenge. That's your research project. And they're really embracing this question. That brings me some hope. And then the other thing is the power of the message. If we go back to the beginning of the 20th century, let's say the 1920s, is the rise of marketing, the rise of public relations, is this period where design really started to transform the quality of people's lives, and we get all of these I talked about it there a little bit, these notions of progress and the improvement of life. And it gets complicated because you start for the first time to see the manipulation of desire. Rather than artifacts, products satisfying needs, they're meeting desires and manipulating desires. And so if that is something plastic, if that's something manipulable in a dark way, then maybe people really can be encouraged to behave slightly differently. And that's our job as well, is to make these alternatives plausible and available. That's where a lot of the open source ideas come in. And of course, ideas start small. There'll be a few early adopters, but as those ideas become more acceptable, and as more and more companies with a positive attitude, I mean, there are a few phone companies starting to emerge now that aren't using these extractive models. The Fairphone from the Netherlands is a good example. I think at some point those alternative models will become more sexy, and young people will not be wanting the iPhone. It'd be like wearing a fur coat in the 1980s after the campaign from, was it Vogue and all of the supermodels. You know, that's an example of how the marketing can be turned around to something more positive and appropriate. But the challenge is enormous, really. It's the worst question to ask. It's a good one, but a tough one.
No question. Maybe for online, people online have a question, you can turn on your mic and possibly your camera if you can. Nobody?
Or use the text.
Or use the text. Then I'll have one. But you started your presentation with this idea of having an impact and the importance of the impact in what we propose. That was a bit the critiques you had to speculative design, saying it's open, it's free.
Yeah.
Well, it's great in the museum, then it disappears in the archives, and we're done with it. Then obviously here now you are completely flipping the consideration and say, well, I need to do something that will have an impact.
Yeah.
You're proposing, for example, once again, I'll just use the last example of the gravity battery. It's quite advanced still for somebody, as we spoke on the very beginning, who cannot cut a piece of wood.
Yeah.
So what's the consideration there is that we de-learned, if it's an English word, we de-learned over generations to manipulate matter and to work around. So how can we get back to this for your proposition in a way to be
that's
addressable?
Yeah, of course, it's another constraint. it's not on this talk, but there is a constraint that relates to making. I mean, I've friends in the UK. Daniel Charney works a lot with the educational department he's a fantastic designer, but to the importance of making, the importance of students still learning what I was very lucky. I grew up in an industrial town in the 80s, and we learned complicated things, torre metal, things that at 14 years old we were making quite complex things. And now I look at my son, who is 19, and he at school learned absolutely nothing. I mean, he can do remarkable things on a computer. His 3D modeling abilities are mind-blowing. 3D printing, but ask him to screw two bits of wood together and he's helpless. So there is a bigger question of education there. And it's the rigor of the education that allows someone not just to follow rules, but to have more of it's a crappy TV reference, but a kind of MacGyver-esque ability to problem solving, similar to Breaking Bad. When the key character has such an understanding of chemistry, he can do anything from hacking together a battery to get his motorhome working when he's in the desert through old coins. He understands the fundamentals. And I think that's the kind of education that we should be giving children, because it's from that knowledge that we can adapt and solve questions. That's a bigger question about what education is. Within the context of that project, that's why we started building networks with the local metal shop and the woodwork shop. So it's not necessarily about DIY, it's more about do it with who you know. And we can then build the community all locally, rather than the objects being made somewhere else in the world. You can go and visit the shop, you can see your lamp being made. If it gets broken, you're just a phone call away, and they can. And so it becomes a much more of a collaborative approach to making, where the knowledge is situated somewhere nearby and you take advantage of that local knowledge. And of course, again, that will change from place to place. My dream for the gravity battery was similar to what I said about the vacuum cleaner, was to commission one in 12 countries with basic instructions, but using local craftspeople, and see the materials that come out and the approach to the gearbox itself. And then they'd be a beautiful thing to compare, because they're the same but different. There's no quick answer again to the making thing.
But it's interesting, because in what I hear now, you put two different approach. I like, and I'm fully convinced on this idea that we need in education to reconsider making as a global term. And it can be really this approach of the world that we have on how the things are made and how I can do something with it. Basically. And either it's digital stuff, it's mechanical stuff, it's chemistry stuff, it's bio stuff. All the thing is, it's an attitude towards what I can do with my hands, my knowledge, my neighbors, to do something. So that's indeed a pedagogical stuff. But at the same time, that's a vacuum cleaner also that remind me that is that there's this idea of attractiveness, of interest for that. I'm much personally, but it's an education possibly as well. I'm much more curious about the homemade vacuum cleaner than the Dyson one, because the Dyson one is inaccessible to me as a machine. It's accessible for the use, but not for the inside. Whereas the second one, I say, well, okay, I can look into it and make sense of it. But it's not sexy. I mean, it's another form of sexiness, actually, right? But it's this stuff also that I think, I don't know, is that not something away from pedagogy? Is that not away from education? But it's more something about how we get people to relate to the things.
Yeah, it comes back to the same challenge, like, I suppose, that if we want people to, I hate the idea of behavior change. It sounds like you're manipulating or something like that, but it's just the path that we've gone on since, it's the end of analog, really. Analog was great because things were tangible, and therefore hackable, or as things become increasingly digital and then computational, the tangibility disappears. And of course there are still clever people can hack and do that stuff, but it's less available than an analog object or device. But then when on top of that you put legislation, like today a modern car, if you open up the front, if you open up the bonnet and take a screwdriver, your warranty's gone. So it's not even about knowledge anymore. It becomes almost a legal issue as well, that we're not supposed to touch things. You know, these apples today, you can't even open it anymore. Everything is hermetically sealed, and you know it's discouraged rather than encouraged.
Right.
Apple didn't used to be like that. The early computational days, it was all about hacking and modding and so on. We've ended up in this situation where you need to be a computer scientist to go anywhere near it, you know, and that's wrong. It's
wrong. Yeah.
It's problematic.
If you want to react, you can, no? Because otherwise, yes.
It's interesting because now you can buy a computer and buy some softwares, but never be like the owners of what's inside the software. So it's also not the big issues, I think. But my question was more about, I just wanted to know if you teach kids at school about design. If so, if you have a good class. And from your perspective, do you think it shouldn't be like a mandatory class for the next generation?
I'll give you 1 minute just for people online. I don't know if they could hear, so I just the question was very much about if James teaches kids about design, and if so, what's the feedback, and how this type of education to be mandatory in our education systems. Yeah.
Very nice. At what age does someone stop being a kid?
Let's say 8, 9, 10 years old. Start.
No, never. I've been very selfish. I've been teaching since 2005, but only at master level and above. So I don't have to deal with bad behavior. Usually it happens sometimes. But my oldest friend from home is a school teacher in the design department, and he teaches in the way that, well, it's very difficult because the curriculum is forced upon him. He's told exactly what he should teach, but he's a little bit subversive and finds ways around that. And he's very much of that mold that if you teach people with a broad set of skills and get them really understanding the core of the problem, then they will come up with very unusual solutions. I studied maths at one point when I was about 18, and I really love maths, and I love getting to the core of the problem, the core of the question, really understanding how it worked. And I'd got a friend who was brilliant at revising but understood nothing, so he would just memorize the numbers or the flow of the numbers, which he'd get 100% if the question was phrased in exactly the same way, but if they reversed the question, he was useless. And that's the same thing with the design education, is if you really understand how things work, you'll be able to do marvelous things. My friend teaches like that, is very inspirational. But I do think that type of teaching is absolutely critical as we get into this complicated period, because people are becoming, I think, increasingly useless. It's a generalization and it's quite negative, but the amount of people who just, nothing is repairable, everything is disposable, they don't engage with things. There is a flip side to that. And I'm not a massive fan of kind of digital media, but YouTube is fantastic for repair it at home videos. You find anything and you put the model in and you say, this has gone wrong. I repaired my washing machine. I didn't know what was wrong. I fiddled around. Oh, the brushes are gone. It's this model. You can buy them over here and you do this. And, you know, I repaired my washing machine in about 2 hours, and it was all through YouTube. So there are things out there which are positive, and my son is starting to be inspirational. He was horrible for a long time, just playing games. He's become super inspirational because he's actually online all the time now, figuring things out through YouTube and coming up with them. He's doing a design degree in the Netherlands, and all of this game playing and his understanding of the digital culture has actually been quite useful. And you see this kind of hybrid stuff now coming out, whereas before his whole life was on screen. He's come off screen to have this kind of hybrid hacking approach, and it's quite interesting. So I probably wouldn't say that. I think there was a question online.
Yes. How do you decide which problems to tackle with your work? Do you have a growing list, or do you respond opportunities that are hot topics, or is there a more systematic approach to looking for signals?
That's a good question. I'd say there's a slow evolution through time. A lot of our early projects with Jimmy were really questioning and critiquing communication. So the tooth implant, the isophone, we did another project called the interstitial space helmet. The Small project was very much about communication. From Madeira onwards, there was a big shift. This was when the Reconstrained design side took off, and a lot of work on energy. It's a theme that we're still looking at visiting. My problem recently, since probably 2020, 21, is that I've been responsible for running the master at ONS, and my pedagogical responsibilities take away quite a lot of time. There's a lot of bureaucracy, there are a lot of meetings, and time to develop research projects is a little bit limited. But we rather than adapting the way we used to and just developing projects kind of on the cuff, we much more now looking for calls, responding to kind of horizon projects or new European Bauhaus projects, and trying to raise the ambition. The one interesting project is the link I shared there at the end, the SURF project, Speculative Urban Futures. That's with a great consortium, and that's really, it's not so much a subject, it's looking at the sharing of design methodologies and approaches. There is a focus on energy on that one. We're just working on potentially starting a digital democracy project with a consortium, so looking at the issues that relate to democracy today and how it's potentially undermined by fake news and things like Facebook misuse. What other projects are we looking at? There's a project in the Bordeaux region near the Cognac, looking at water infrastructure and water systems there, and potentially mapping and representing where transitions between water states happen, and when things become problematic or polluted, and the mix between natural systems and artificial. So there's no real rules. It's at the moment, as I said, there's a shift towards things that relate to energy, to transition, to environmental issues, and a kind of bigger expanded role of design in that. And the big project at the moment is related to this talk, a book on reconstrained design for Bloomsbury. So all of these this is a bit of an experiment, this talk, just trying to put it into the public domain like this, is just testing a few ideas out, but the book should be done next year.
How do you so you are at Venice, right? Venice, exactly.
Yeah.
Do you have issues justifying this project, this activity as a academic research domain? I know. And if so, which I imagine so, what arguments do you bring forward to point out the academic research quality of all this work? I'm sharing the
I see your pain.
Yes.
Yeah. A few different strategies. I do maintain a part-time position with RMIT in Australia and supervise PhDs through them, and for them there's no problem. The Australian approach to design research is very, very mature, and there's no issue there. In the UK it was a little bit, it's quite tough in France. There's a good side and the bad side. At ENS we are quite well supported. by the school. We're struggling a little bit with the formulaic systems of qualification, météconf, etc. The role of the CNU is problematic, and designers aren't really trained to fit into these pathways that are very normal for a mathematician or a chemist. So you can try and adapt your approach and fit into that, or you struggle on the fringes, and I'm probably on the fringe, and Laurent sitting there is on the fringe a little bit, coming more from the art school pathway. I think I told you before, I have my qualification for professor refused twice because I haven't published enough papers. I've got a lot of projects, but they don't count as research for the CNU. So yeah, it's a challenge, but you can try and you can hope to change the system a little bit from within, and I think that is happening. The research community in France is growing enormously, and you know, the forum that you're sharing on, the kind of discussion we're having. We just had the SCRS evaluation at the CRD, and that was a fantastic discussion, and we were evaluated very well. So there's a growing recognition, I think. And within ONFS itself, it's becoming more and more easy, and a lot of the other departments, the scientific laboratories, are very keen to work with us. So we're sending students off, having the stage with, I don't know, biological electronics department or the mathematics department, looking at AI. And it's not just about design and vulgarization, the kind of public engagement-y stuff, but how could these different disciplines collaborate together? What would be the strengths of each? And a lot of the starting point of that is communication. And this is the problem that design has had, is we communicate really, really well on certain levels, but design research communicates quite badly somehow. People don't know what it is. So I was speaking to a colleague in the Borelli, it's the mathematics department. He said, I'm really intrigued by design, but I've got no idea what you do in the department. And I said, I'm kind of intrigued by a lot of what you do. And I love maths and the whole AI stuff. Of course, I know all the ChatGPT and the obvious stuff online, but you're doing kind of complex modeling and all sorts of interesting things. I don't know what that is. And that then starts the discussion. And it's another constraint there. This is something that I'll be writing about, the constraints of disciplinary siloing. Because each department, each discipline will have its own metric system, its own form of publication, its own form of peer review, and it really destroys collaboration. I've experienced this before with material scientists from Italy. If you know, we really wanted to work together, and material science and design seems like the perfect fit. But at the end of the day, they said, "Oh, we're not going to publish a paper this, so we're not interested. You know, this is useful for us. It's not, you know, we're not going to get any reward points which lead to research funding, so we're just going to stop the collaboration." And it's ridiculous. Yeah. So we don't have that problem at ERNEST so much. It's an interesting time.
But enjoy it.
Yeah.
The we have here, I'll be the same. I came more and more to discuss design as to compare it to his chemistry. I had this big issue of explaining why I need a workshop here. And I explained that when you invite a chemistry professor to work here, the first thing you show is the lab. Yeah. That's the same, that way it starts. That's where the work starts.
Yeah. We had that with the vice president of research is from chemistry. And he totally got the practice-based element, you know, because a lot of their research will be in the laboratory, and the paper is just the way you disseminate that. But they have symbols. They can translate the laboratory into symbols that then can be understood by others. But what's our equivalent of the symbol? Yeah, the symbol in chemistry. And that's an interesting question for design research. When we talk about documentation and dissemination, we don't really have the idea of the symbol, because design research is so diverse.
Yeah,
so
very
complicated.
Diverse, and it's the toothbrushes, John Zimmerman expression. It's a tool. Each of us have ours, and we don't like to share so much.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Yes, a last one, or maybe online.
What's the
Sort of.
that's the experience?
We're distant partners. You know, it's like a divorce that never happened. He's still in London. We worked together until 2015 on projects, and then I went to Madeira. He stayed in London, and we both became entrenched in the different jobs that we were doing. So he's teaching at Goldsmiths in London, and it's so time consuming. So we meet every few months and talk about doing something together again, because it's when we're both happiest. It's someone that we really kind of learn to talk to and develop ideas and projects together. Yep. Yeah, he comes more from a fine art background. I'm more of an engineer, so there was a kind of complementary set of skills in the beginning. But it was just someone that we just talk all the time, and ideas would grow and emerge. But we're just in touch at the moment to re-exhibit the Afterlife project. So there'll be a chance there to get the dust off the objects and start thinking about the exhibition again. There's a chance we maybe one day do something together again, because we never fell out. There was never a problem. It was just different kind of lifestyle choices took over and made collaboration a bit tricky.
The very last question that I will ask each time, besides your own books, what book did matter for you as a design researcher?
Oh, how many?
One.
You're on the desert
Just
island.
one.
This
Just
thing,
one.
you can have
That's
one
the
book.
thing. Just one book. There was one proper.
If it's
Something like
really, it can be.
You,
Does it got to relate to design?
no, it could be a movie as well. It could be something else. I would have asked the question 10 minutes ago, or in 10 minutes, it could have been another answer. It's fine. Just one now.
Yeah.
That come
Okay.
up.
I've got a lot of design ones, but I'm not going to be boring. I'm going to say The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury.
Okay, because I have no.
It's science fiction from the 1950s, but it's not about machines and power and space travel and shiny things. It's really about complex human emotion. And so there's the idea of Mars colonization, but it really is talked about from a human perspective. I opened my PhD with a quote from the Martian Chronicles, and what the reason being is that he makes the colonization of Mars sound far more plausible and realistic than a lot of speculative design projects I was looking at the time, and the problems that go with colonization and switched and kind of complex power structures and challenging all of our notions and expectations. So it's not about design, but it's quite, for me, it was very influential.
Thank you very much, James.
Thank you.
Nice book. Thank you.